You can start.
Მოგესალმებით ბატონებო და ქალბატონებო. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Добрый вечер, пани и панове. Labas vakaras, ponios ir panai. My name is Alexander Mikabiridze. I'm professor of history at Louisiana State University, and I will be the moderator of tonight's event. And what a wonderful event it is. The presentation of the Georgian edition of Professor Timothy Snyder's superb study, Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus. I want to thank the organizers, the Heinrich Böll's Foundation, Ilias State University, and Poesia Press for making this event possible. This is a very timely publication for Georgia, one that will challenge popular assumptions about the ways that ethnic nations arise and will make the Georgian readers, like many of others, ponder the complexity of modern national identity, help them explore the subtleties, paradoxes of the evolution of nations in Eastern Europe. Tonight's event will feature Dr. Snyder's talk on the core themes of the book, as well as presentations from our distinguished panelists. Now, due to the time constraints, I want first to ask Dr. Stefan Meister, head of the South Caucasus office of Heinrich Böll Foundation, to offer his brief welcoming remarks before we cede the floor to Professor Snyder. Dr. Meister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Warm welcome from my side. Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is the Green German political foundation, is very happy that we were able to contribute to the translation of this very important book of Timothy Snyder from English into Georgian. We have two main aims here. I think the first aim for us is to strengthen academic literature in Georgia, and to translate into Georgian language international important literature. And the second is to raise a discussion on nation building in a time where the instrumentalization and the debate about history in Georgia is ongoing, yeah, and it is very important. And I would like to thank Natalia Alashvili from Poesia Press and also Lasha Otremezuri, who helped us to set up this book, and also would like to thank Tim Snyder that he agreed on that we could translate the book into the Georgian language. I think this is a very important contribution to the Georgian debate, and yeah, I'm looking forward for your keynote and the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very honored to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Timothy Snyder, the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Dr. Snyder is one of the most distinguished historians today, having written extensively on the history of the 20th century Europe with such best-selling books as Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, Thinking the 20th Century, which he co-wrote with the great Tony Judt, Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, and on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, which I regularly use in my survey classes. A true Renaissance man, he speaks 5 languages, reads 10 more, which always enriches his scholarship. It is truly an honor to have you here, Dr. Snyder. Without further ado.
Thank you very much. Well, the honor is mine. I mean, it's a wonderful moment at any time when a book is completed, and I'm very grateful to the Böll Foundation, to Stefan Meister, to Poesia Press for making this happen. And I look forward to reactions from Georgian readers. What I'm going to do is just take about 25 minutes and try to present some of the major themes of the book. And then those of you who have joined us will have a chance to listen to colleagues approach the book from different angles. Where we need to start, I think, is with the origins of this book. So we're speaking now in the summer of 2021. The origins of this book go back about 30 years to a different historical moment where different questions were being asked. Although, as has already been pointed out, some of these questions about nation building, for example, are relevant again or never stopped being relevant. When I started thinking about the themes of this book in the early 1990s, a major question in the social sciences and in history had to do with the origins of the nation. And that is the question which I was trying to in some small way, try to answer. At the time, and I think this remains true to some extent today, at the time, there were roughly two schools of thought about the origins of the nation. On the one hand, there was the argument that the nation was very old. The nation was essentially a matter of continuity. The history of the nation could be told in terms of an enduring language and culture. Perhaps politics was interrupted, perhaps imperial rule intervened, but the nation itself was old, continuous, essentially unchanged. Then there was another school of thought which made the argument that the nation was very new, that the nation was a matter of mass politics, that mass politics had only existed for 2 centuries or perhaps 1 century, that the nation was one more form of mass society, like the class, that as such, nations were a result of processes which didn't date back very far. And then you could debate just which processes these were. Did the modern state bring about the modern nation? Did the Industrial Revolution bring about the modern nation? Did some kind of anti-colonial struggle bring about the modern nation? But whatever you think about the structure, it would always be a modern structure, a contemporary structure. So the debate was, is the nation old or is the nation new? And as of the time that I became a student and started thinking about these things, the argument that was winning was the nation is new. There were 3 very important books which were published around 1983, which seemed to carry the day. One of them was Nations and Nationalism by Ernest Gellner. Another was Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. And a third was a collection of essays edited by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger called The Invention of Tradition. And these 3 books together, along with many others, but these were probably the crucial 3, at least in the English language debate at the time, seemed to win the argument that the nation was new rather than old. So I came to this debate as a historian who had just written a dissertation about a Polish intellectual. And this Polish intellectual, his name was Kazimierz Kallis-Kraus. And he had an interesting argument about what is new and what is old. He argued that the more radical a form of politics is, the further it reaches back into the past. And whatever you think about this particular argument, it certainly shakes things up because it makes you think, I thought the past was what was conservative. How could the past be radical? And so when I started writing The Reconstruction of Nations, it's important to know that I had this idea in mind, that things might not be as they seem, that what looks like it's conservative might not actually be conservative, right? The past might actually be a terrain of something which is radical. So the argument that I make, the main conceptual argument that I make in The Reconstruction of Nations is that the nation is both new and old, right? It's both new and old, hence the word reconstruction. So the people who think that the nation is new talk about construction, right? And the problem with the idea of construction is that it begs the question, construction from what, right? So no one except for God can create from nothing, right? So if the nation is constructed, it raises the question, from what? So I instead talked about reconstruction. And in doing this, I wanted to concede the point that something about the nation is new, but whatever is new about the nation has to be built upon something which already existed. The nation has to be in some sense historical, but it's not historical the way that ethnic nationalists say. So the ethnic national argument says that the nation has been around for a long time. We have a right to our land because we've been here forever. The culture is essentially continuous, right? I wanted to say, no, that's not true either. That's not the nation. The people who say that the nation is new are correct in that the nation only exists as a self-aware mass phenomenon. The fact that I speak German and Stefan Meister speaks German does not mean that we belong to the same political community, right? I was agreeing with the people who say that the nation is new, in that the nation has to be a self-aware mass community. And we simply don't find something like that usually in the 18th or 17th or earlier centuries. So the way that I try to make the argument is by following history, which seems like a very simple method. I know everyone says that they're doing history, but rather than follow ideas or ideologies, rather than take national thinkers too literally, I just looked at land. I just looked at territory. Because in history, this is my very simple method. I find that if you can hold one thing steady, then you can observe what's moving. So my method was to look at some territories in what's now Western Ukraine, some territories in what's now Lithuania and Belarus over the course of centuries, and try to see what changed. And what I found was essentially this, that the nations that emerged on this territory all did the same thing. They all made the same move. The move that they made in the 19th century was to say, the nation is the people, right? The nation is the people. Now that might seem totally conventional, unsurprising. And if it seems conventional and unsurprising, that's because the people who made that argument have won, or they've won in a lot of parts of Europe. But at the time that they made the argument, it was in fact radical, because in all of the cases I'm talking about, the Polish case, the Lithuanian case, the Belarusian case, and the Ukrainian case, in all of these cases, there was a previous idea of the nation, and that previous idea of the nation did not include everyone. The previous idea of the nation was about the nobility, right? It was a Republican idea about a nobility being the nation. And that word, of course, nation, was the word that was used. So in order to build a new nation, right? Like, I mean, as Nietzsche says, if you're going to build a new temple, you have to destroy a temple. If you're going to build a new nation, you have to destroy the old idea of the nation. So, and this is what happens in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the ideas that win, or at the level of rhetoric, are the ideas that say the nation is the people. The nation are the people who speak Polish or Lithuanian or Belarusian or Ukrainian, right? And what's not the nation is the elite, the old multilingual, multicultural, multi-confessional elite. That's not the nation. Now, what does this mean, though? It means that the people who are saying that the nation is real because it's eternal are breaking with actual history. They're making a move against the actual historical past, right? So, I mean, the word paradoxical was already used, right? This is the dialectic. This is the paradox, if you like, of nation building, that these nations who speak about eternal traditions have to break the traditions that actually exist in front of them. There's a simple logic here. If you want to have a modern mass nation based on language, that means that you have to break any kind of multinational, multi-confessional elite tradition, which happens to be there in your history. And so this is what happens in Poland and Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine. The actual early modern history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has to be set aside in favor of stories about continuous Belarusian, Lithuanian, Polish, or Ukrainian history. Now, there's an interesting implication to this, and again, it verges on the paradoxical. The implication is that these four nations are basically the same, right? So if you ask so the whole point of forming a linguistic nation is to be different. The whole point is to say, well, you speak Lithuanian, therefore you must be Lithuanian. You speak Polish, therefore you must be Polish, and so on. The whole point is to break things apart. But looked at analytically, all of these nations are the same in that they're all doing the same thing. They're all breaking with the same history. They have a common history and they all break with it in the same way. whether you're a Polish ethnic nationalist or a Lithuanian ethnic nationalist, it doesn't matter. A Ukrainian ethnic nationalist, it doesn't matter. You're still breaking with the older shared multinational history that you have, right? And so when you look at it this way, the end effect is that the nation is both new and old, right? It's both new and old. It can only be seen for what it is by a kind of critical history. This brings me to the second point, which is about the actual creation of nations as societies. So in the 19th century, the idea of the nation as the people wins, but the people didn't actually necessarily know that. It's only in the 20th century that this idea that the nation is the people and the people are the nation becomes truly widespread, at least in the part of the world that I'm studying. Even in Poland in the 1920s and 1930s, speaking Polish did not mean that you necessarily identified with a Polish nation. The same was true in other parts of the region. So what happens in the 20th century to bring about this identification at the level of society between the people and the nation is a lot of violence. So there are some positive attempts to educate the nation. Of course, there are states that exist in the 1920s and 30s, of course, but very often one finds it's violence which leaves people identifying with the nation, violence which targets them as members of the nation, and it has the consequence of having them identify with the nation. So one example is ethnic cleansing. If you think the nation is already there in society, you think that nationalism is a cause of ethnic cleansing. But very often it's the other way around. Very often it's ethnic cleansing that is the cause of nationalism, because ethnic cleansing by its nature removes all other kinds of identifications. It takes you away from your local society. It puts you together with other people who speak the same language, who have also been uprooted. It leaves you with no other kind of identification than the nation. If you've lost your home and you're dropped into a country that you don't know, but it's supposed to be your country, that's the level of identification that remains to you. So in the book, in the middle part of the book, I go through some examples of this phenomenon. I talk about how the city of Vilnius, for example, becomes Lithuanian, which is largely a matter of elimination, the elimination of the Jews during the Holocaust, the elimination of the Poles by Soviet deportations after the Second World War, and then the arrival of Lithuanians under Soviet rule. And of course, there's a paradox here, another one, which is that it's precisely Soviet rule, Soviet power, which makes Vilnius a Lithuanian city, right? As the Lithuanians said at the time, Vilnius is Lithuanian, but Lithuania is Soviet. And so there are ways in which, and this is again a paradoxical, perhaps surprising thing, there are ways in which Soviet power uses violence to resolve, as people said at the time, national questions. This is also true in Western Ukraine. A big part of the book concerns ethnic cleansing in Western Ukraine. Ethnic cleansing in Western Ukraine was actually begun by Ukrainian nationalists acting completely outside of the state, but it was completed by the Soviet Union in 1944, 1945, 1946, and 1947, with the result that Western Ukraine was added to the Soviet Union, but without its national minorities. The Jews have been murdered during the war, and then most of the Poles have been forced out during or after the war. That doesn't create a nation necessarily, but it makes territory ethnically simpler, and a lot of Soviet actions had that general direction. So that's the second part of the argument. The third part of the argument, the third part of the book, concerns the late 20th century. And it concerns and this is, I think, something which is quite relevant for today. It concerns what politics can do with the past. So let me start by not talking about politics, but by talking about history, just to make an analogy. History is not about making myths. If a historian is making myths, then that historian is not doing his or her job. But history is also not about fighting myths. If you just fight myths, in a strange way, you end up reconfirming them. You make them more legitimate. What history is about is actually trying to understand. And when you understand, then the myths themselves just become part of the story. At the end of the day, the myths are just a part of the story. They're not the story. You're not so angry, you don't believe them, but you're also not angry about them. They're just part of the story. That something similar can be said about foreign policy. Foreign policy is not about confirming national myths. It's also not about fighting national myths. Foreign policy is about advancing national interests. And in order to advance national interests, you sometimes have to find a way to set a myth or a story aside. You sometimes have to be able to bracket your own beliefs. And in the third part of the book, I go through a moment where this actually happened. And again, it's important now to remember the context. I'm writing in the late 1990s. The Yugoslav wars are still going on. And the one way to think about the question of the book at this point would be, why is there bloodshed in Yugoslavia in Southeastern Europe, but there's no bloodshed in Northeastern Europe, right? If we read the whole book, we realize Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian, Ukrainian history is also very complicated and sometimes very bloody. So, and just as in Southeastern Europe, there are borders that would seem to be contestable. So why is it that there's no bloodshed in Northeastern Europe? And so I talk in the last part of the book about a foreign policy, which is about the state rather than about memory. And I talk in particular about how Poland preemptively recognized its borders with Lithuania and Ukraine before Lithuania and Ukraine even existed as independent states. And how Polish diplomats made the argument at the time that we're not going to talk about history until we've resolved certain practical questions, right? And at the time, the way the Polish diplomats talked about this was as European values, which they were admittedly largely making up as they went along, but it was a good story, the story about European values. And so the critical thing or the interesting thing about this is that it worked, at least for a time. If Poland had behaved differently, it's very possible that it would have been much harder for Ukraine to emerge as an independent state, just to make a very big claim. Because historically, Ukraine has many claimants upon its territory, German, Polish, Russian. The German claim was gone. And in 1989, the Poles said, we have no claim on your territory. We're in favor of your independence. We're on your side, which meant that for the first time in centuries, the only issue for Ukraine was the Russian issue. And although Ukrainian politics is very complicated and the Russian issue is very painful, especially right now, it's the only challenge to Ukrainian sovereignty. There could have been a different one. Another way to think about this is Polish membership in the European Union. Poland was a big, poor country in the early 1990s. Having the European Union admit Slovenia or Estonia or even the Czech Republic, that's one thing. But Poland, if Poland had been a big, poor country which had minority problems or border conflicts, then the whole history of the European Union might have gone differently. Poland might not have been admitted in the first round. So a foreign policy which sets memory to one side can actually work. Now, of course, I'm now talking about the first part of the 1990s. I'm talking about events of almost 20 years ago. I'm sorry, almost 30 years ago. Now, of course, we see that Polish foreign policy is sometimes very different, right? Sometimes there are moments where Polish foreign policy is very much about memory. And Polish foreign policy recently has been much less consistently, for example, pro-Ukrainian than it was in the early 1990s. That's just one example of how these questions are still relevant, this question of what foreign policy should do with memory. And what the book is insisting upon is that diplomats are not slaves to memory politics, right? You can choose to make memory politics, but that's a choice. A government can choose to do memory politics. That's a choice. And it may feel good and it may have good short-term results, but it may not be the same thing as raison d'etat. I was asked to say something about reception history. So I'll just say a few words about what I remember of the reception of this book. The main controversies about this book at the time were about the Ukrainian-Polish ethnic cleansing of 1943 to 1947, because I was the first person, I believe, to write about these events in a Western language. And so a lot of the things I said were quite controversial, whether from a Polish side or from a Ukrainian side. But the thing which I was trying to do, and which I hope comes through in reading the book, is to explain ethnic cleansing in non-ethnic terms. So it's very easy to say Polish-Ukrainian ethnic cleansing happened because the Poles are bad. It's very easy to say it happened because the Ukrainians are bad. But what I tried to do in the book was give an explanation which had to do with multiple occupations of the territory in question, which had to do with the way that politics changed during the Second World War, which had to do with the way that centrist and left-wing kinds of politics became impossible under Soviet and German occupation. I tried to show a whole process which led to ethnic cleansing in 1943. In other words, I tried to make a non-ethnic argument about ethnic cleansing. And so I got some criticism from both sides about that, but I think the argument has held up pretty well. Another bit of the reception history, I guess, has to do with the attempt to write transnational history. So now, everyone and their sister does transnational history, but in the early 1990s, that wasn't true. And my method here was to take territories that weren't clearly parts of one nation. These were territories that had belonged to multiple empires, that had been divided among multiple states and so on. I tried to ignore state boundaries and imperial boundaries and just focus on the territory. And so then that became what people called transnational history. And it's also part of what was later called the spatial turn in history. So now I'm using fancy historiographical language, but there's this thing called the spatial turn in the 21st century. And this book, I think, had something to do with that. And then one final thing about the reception history, which I just want to mention at this particular point in time. The book did very well among historians of Belarus and among Belarusians. Not because historians of Belarus and Belarusians always agreed with me, but because in this history, Belarus plays an equal part with the other nations. It's just as present as Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine are, and that hasn't always been the case. And looking back from today's perspective, that's one of the things that I'm most pleased about with this book, is that I learned Belarusian, and I took the Belarusian part of the story seriously. And when I did that, it confirmed the general argument. That Belarus has its specificities, but it belongs to the general history of the emergence of nations in Europe. So those are the remarks that I prepared. I hope that you find them useful. And again, I'm really gratified that the book could appear in Georgian, and I appreciate very much the possibility to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Snyder, for this insightful commentary. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to reading the translation. I think I should mention that the book has been edited by George Mamoulia, who is an eminent scholar in his own right, and he's with us. So thank you. Dr. Snyder, I believe, can you stay with us, or you have to go to the commitment?
I can say for a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, so how about we quickly ask for any questions from the audience? And I think we do have one question from Zarina Burkadze, and she asks, are there any particular signs that indicate that the nation moves away from the old pattern to become a new nation?
So first of all, I just wanted to mention while I can that I assigned Professor Mamoulia's book, the one that he did with
yes.
Yes, and I assigned it in my seminar this last fall, so my students just read it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and they loved it. And by the way, they said the writing was very good, which I thought was interesting. Since you wrote it together with Hiraki Kuromiya, right? And neither of you are native speakers, but one of my students said, I want to write like that when I become a historian. So I thought that was good. On the question of new, I mean, I may not understand it. I think that all nations are new in the sense that all nations involve a break from the past. Whether there's a next stage is a question which I'm thinking about a lot now, because I think the nation as it exists now is a kind of, it's a reaction to empire, which is itself dependent upon some larger unit of politics. So, you know, I'm in the European Union now, where there are lots of little nations, and all these little nations owe their, if not their existence, at least their prosperity to the European Union. It doesn't have to be the European Union, but it has to be some larger unit of politics. And so I guess I wonder too what the next stage is. Like, can there be does the nation actually make sense without this higher level of politics? I tend to think not. I mean, when I look at the problems of the American nation now, and America is a big nation and an old nation. I mean, to my way of thinking, the United States is about as old as nations get. And we're having tremendous problems, partly because there's nothing else that we belong to. We don't have any other reference points. We just have ourselves. And just having the reference point of yourself is very difficult.
Thank you so much. We have another question for you. This one is from Mr. Elguja Sechniashvili. Do you think that the creation of Belarusian nation was a natural process, or was it the result of a Soviet affirmative action?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question. I think the question, you know, is really about what would be natural, you know. So taking a step back, right? I'm in Austria, right? And we're talking about a book which was translated with the help of a German foundation in German. I mean, Austria is a wonderful country. I enjoy living here. I don't think it has to exist, though. Right? I don't think Austria has to exist. I hope it, you know, I don't mean right now, but I mean historically speaking, there was no fatum which said that Austria has to exist. And I'm afraid that's true of most, if not all, of the European countries. If you dig hard enough, I think you come to this conclusion, which is that the modern nation was probably inevitable, right? Like, here I agree with the constructivists. Like, once you had the Industrial Revolution and you had bureaucracy, and once you tried to educate the population, you were going to get nations. But which ones? Which ones, right? And here's where the art, so that's the science of history. The science of history are those processes, right? But there's also the art of history, which is the personalities and the contingencies and the accidents, right? That mean that we have the nations that we do, right? Did there have to be Norway? No. So as I get to Belarus, what I'm trying to do is normalize the question. I don't think there had to be a Belarus, but I tend to think there didn't have to be most of the nations that exist. I mean, look at my nation. If the British had fought a slightly more successful war at the end of the 18th century, my nation wouldn't exist, or at least not in the same form. So yes, I agree, like, broadly that Belarus is contingent, but I don't think that makes Belarus special. Now, as far as Soviet affirmative action, the Belarusian national movement was already present in the 19th century. It had the great misfortune, and this is another paradox, it had the great misfortune of being entirely in the Russian Empire. So if you look at Poland, right, Poland was partitioned between Prussia and Austria and Russia. And of course, the partitions are remembered mythologically as a period of suffering, right? The body of the nation is torn apart. But in fact, if you're not going to exist, it's better to be partitioned than to be under one empire. Because if you're logically speaking, one of the empires is going to be less repressive than the other. Moreover, there will come times when one of the empires might try to use you against the other empire, and that might give you a chance. And if you look at Ukraine, you know, Ukraine was divided between the Russian Empire and the Habsburg monarchy. That was very important for Ukrainian national development, because it meant that in the 1860s and 1870s, when Ukrainian language started to be forced out in the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian intellectuals could move to Lemberg, to Lviv, to Lviv, and they could publish there and they could study there, right? And the great Ukrainian historian Hrushevsky could write his history of Ukraine from Galicia, from the Habsburg monarchy. What's different about Belarus is that all of Belarus is inside the Russian Empire. And that's actually a disadvantage. So when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is partitioned at the end of the 18th century, all the territory that's now Belarus falls under the Russian Empire. And that's a disadvantage. That does slow things down. Affirmative action in Belarus was real, but the Great Terror of 1937, 1938 largely decapitated the new Belarusian intelligentsia, which had been created. So no, I wouldn't say that Belarus is a creation of Soviet policy. I can maybe do one more question, then I really have to run if there's another question.
Let me ask more broadly, because one of the themes that you've explored is the connection between democratization and the nationalist conflict. How did your thought evolve since writing this book on this subject of connection between these two processes?
I think, yeah, I think if anything, my thinking is a little more cosmopolitan than it was back then. So democratization is a great question. I mean, one way to think about this is to say, look, democratization worked in Poland because, and this is what a lot of people said at the time, Stalin did Poland a favor, right? Stalin gave Poland better borders. Stalin finished off the ethnic cleansing. So now look, Poland has 40 million Poles, and that's a good thing. Looking at it from the distance of 30 years, I'm not sure having 40 million Poles was such a good thing, right? Because it turns out that you can divide your nation without any kind of ethnic question, right? The Polish nation is thoroughly divided right now. It's thoroughly polarized. I mean, it's almost as polarized as my country, or it's about the same, right? Or if you look at my country, right? Where's the polarization? It's not between whites and blacks. It's between whites and whites, right? That's the real hard polarization. And so I think one thing that I was thinking, you have to be a cosmopolitan about history, right? You have to be able to see the other person's historical position. You have to be able to say, okay, the other person's historical perspective is different than mine, but in some sense, perhaps fundamentally similar. Like they see events differently, but they've gone through similar historical processes. I would maybe now extend that more to the present than I would have 30 years ago and say something like, you have to do that with the present as well. You have to be able to say, democratization isn't just about clearing away old problems. Democratization is about an active engagement with minority questions and other questions now, not regarded simply as a problem, but regarded as an opportunity. I mean, one thing which I learned, I didn't know very much about the US when I was writing about these places, but one thing that I've learned about the US is that some of the most interesting things in the US happen because of diversity. And that's not just like, oh, I like diversity. Like it's not an aesthetic statement or a political statement. It's a sociological statement that when people are separated out into different communities, they're actually less interesting and do less good work. And so that's part of democratization, which I don't think I fully understood at the time. Like there has to be a pluralism, which is about the present and the future and not just about the past. So, all right, with that, like hopefully hopeful remark.
Thank you so much for your generous. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I know you have to rush. We're looking forward to reading your book.
I'm so glad it's in Georgian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To all the colleagues. Thanks.
We will now move to the second part of our event. First of all, I want to ask Ms. Natalia Alkhazishvili to offer her remarks because she is doing a yeoman's kind of job in publishing, bringing the remarkable academic works, the much needed academic works to the Georgian audience. And I want to thank her and her colleagues for doing it. Ms. Alkhazishvili, please.
Thank you very much. My remarks are very, very brief. I'm very happy that this event is happening. I'm very happy that Professor Snyder was able to join us. And I just wanted to give a round of thanks to everybody, to the Heinrich Böll Foundation, of course, for making this possible. It's been the interpreter, the translator of the book, Keti Kantaria, who is also here, I think. She has been talking about wanting to translate this book for years. And so I'm very glad that that now this opportunity came along, and I want to thank Keti for the wonderful work that she's done. We have collaborated for, this is I think now our fourth book perhaps, and also with Georgi Mamoulia, who is providing comments and taking care of our historical knowledge. Thank you, Georgi, for that as well. It is my big passion to, history is my passion. I'm not a professional historian, of course, but it's, I want people to know more and better about history. And I think it is important for Georgia at this point of time to know, to be able to read in Georgian about its own history. And in this case of the Snyder book about the history of nations where we can make certain links. And I also want to thank you, Alex, for moderating this event.
Thank you.
It's a great honor for us, and also the illustrious panelists, His Excellency, who agreed. And I don't want to butcher your name, but it's Mackiewicz, who who agreed to participate in this event, and Professor Davolute, and also we try to have politicians and historians, or people with political perspective and historical perspective. So I'm very glad that that we have somebody from representing Poland, representing Lithuania, and also two people from Georgia, of course, Beka Kobachidze, who has been very, very instrumental in putting everything together and helping me very much, as well as Georgi Candela, who I also am very thankful for participation in this event. I think I'll just stop here. Thank you all very much. I hope everybody will enjoy the book. It's, by the way, sorry, one more thing. It's already in the bookstores in Tbilisi, so you can all go and buy it. And those who are not in Tbilisi, I will send it to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your remarks. I think before I introduce our first speaker, I do want to mention for the audience to make sure that they post their questions in the chat, and as they listen to the panelists, so that we can have an interesting discussion at the end of the panel. Our first presenter is His Excellency Mariusz Maszkiewicz, the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Republic of Poland to Georgia. He previously represented Poland in Belarus for several years. And he's alumni of the famed Jagiellonian University. He has taught at the Faculty of Law and Administration of the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński's University in Warsaw, the Center for Eastern European Studies at the University of Warsaw and other Polish academic institutions. He has published monographs, more than 10 monographs, and edited works, as well as dozens of articles on the international relations, the nature of history and culture and nationalism. And today he will discuss Poland's Eastern policy, something that Professor Snyder briefly touched upon in his remarks, and I look forward to the presentation. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It is not only the great honor and privilege to be invited to this presentation, but also the satisfaction that the project is supported by the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, which is very active also in Poland. I have cooperated for many years with this fund in Warsaw, and so I'm very grateful that we have this important institution also in Caucasus, in Tbilisi. The great value of the work of Professor Snyder lies, among others, in the fact that it brings the problems of this part of Europe closer to the foreign, mostly Western American readers, who finds it difficult to understand certain matters without deepening the specificity of this lands, the peoples inhabiting it, and their deep traditions. Please allow me to be a little bit provocative, to express my doubts, general doubts I got since my university time. I had an opportunity to be let's say, student of Professor Tischner, philosopher. And so we studied Hegel's works, and so appears the problem or the question whether the history is a science. I call it rather the art of telling stories. Maybe my approach is based on the rejection of Hegel's interpretation of the past, what resulted with totalitarianism, nationalism, and other tragedies of the 20th century. Professor Timothy Snyder belongs to this narrow circle of historians who show that history can be a science if we take the starting material and research field seriously. In social sciences, we call it understanding approach. He takes it seriously, very seriously, and therefore deserves my great admiration and respect. But not only for this book, one of his first books, Reconstruction of Nations, but more for his all efforts to zoom in and present problems and challenges faced by the emerging nations in Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, maybe this is the first, his research he has mentioned today, the biography of Kazimierz Koles-Kraus. It's very important work. The second one, which is very valuable in Poland, the Secret War about Wojewoda Józefski, the deep context of the Polish-Ukrainian conflict. Therefore, I want to draw attention to the wider context of the invaluable scientific and journalistic activity of Professor Snyder. Timothy Snyder's biography of Koles-Kraus, the fate of honest social democrats who fell among the millstones of Bolshevism. It has its parallels to another Georgian hero, Noé Jordania. As we know the biography, he knew personally Kautsky, Lenin, Bernstein, and he understood perfectly well the importance of the revival of the national movement in Georgia in the context of European disputes among social democrats and revolutionists. So, I mean, the Rosa Luxemburg and the others. So we have parallels. So Professor Snyder makes us closer also to the Georgian context. It is probably worth persuading Professor Snyder's interest in the subject of the fundamental and extremely inspiring dispute between Jordania and Ilya Chavchavadze. Then we will understand how topical this is, what we are dealing with in today's Georgia, the tensions between traditionalism, very often cynically used by Russia, and the European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Please, my Georgian friends, ask Professor Snyder to be willing to take up this topic, guaranteed success. Our gratitude that it brings closer the history of our part of Europe, allowing more prudent representatives of elites in the USA and Western Europe There were only two such works before the job Professor Snyder did. I would like to remind you, popular story written by Richard Watt. This was the New York lawyer. The book Bitter Glory, Gorzka Chwała in Polish, story that allows Western reader to understand why it is unacceptable to make parallels of pre-war Poland, ruled by Piłsudski's people, Piłsudski itself, with Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union's regimes as it is used in the Soviet or post-Soviet history very often. And the second book, so before what Professor Snyder did, Norman Davies, God's Playground, great explanation of the sense of Polish Republican model of state in the 18th century before partition. Why it has fallen, why it was lost, the sense of freedom in Europe. The Eastern European or Central Europeans, backwarded, fusty, and not enough progressive nations far from the enlightened center of the continent, deserve to be heard, and thanks to such authors, professors, scientists as Timothy Snyder, our painful experience could be visible and realized. These are the reasons that Georgians should read and value titanic work of Professor Snyder. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I hope you'll stay with us. I know you told us
for a few minutes, yeah.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Violeta Davoliute. Labas vakaras. She is a professor at Vilnius University and works at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science. She specializes in the matters of historical trauma, the politics of memory, the national identity in the Baltic region. Her most recent publications are on the post-memory of the Holocaust. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, and among her publications is The Making and Breaking of Soviet Lithuania, Memory and Modernity in the Wake of War. And today she will give us her remarks on how Lithuania was able to navigate the turbulent post-independence waters to emerge as a member of European Union and NATO. Without further ado, Professor Davoliute.
Hello, everybody. I hope you hear me well. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good. First of all, I would like to thank for this honor I'm really honored to be part of this great panel. It's a great event. So first of all, I will start with the book. Timothy Snyder's book, The Reconstruction of Nations, was translated into Lithuanian in 2009. And I will just tell what gaps it filled in. One of the gaps that it really filled in was this comparative perspective that he talked about, that he presented today, and that is quite, that is there in the book. The local domestic research, historical research is frequent in Lithuania, and I'm talking about the contemporary history, is quite inward. In other words, that comparative perspective and focus on processes, I would say, is still lacking, but was certainly lacking in 2009. And this book precisely draws attention to the processes that kind of, that connect different territories, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, and so forth. And that is extremely important. Now we have our own challenges with the processes, and I will point out to a few of them. One of them is precisely how to deal with the Soviet period, for example. Frequently, it's perceived that, in fact, nothing was happening during the Soviet period. History kind of stopped, so it's a great rupture. And so how do you deal with this gap? And another kind of challenge that that we still have to face here in Lithuania is how to deal with the Nazi occupation. That also sometimes seems, well, there was rupture, something stopped, and once again the break, there was there was kind of nothing happening. So I think this book draws attention to the continuities and the fact that even during the times of great rupture, something is happening that has legacy, that has long-lasting legacy. So, and I'm talking about, mass population displacement, about genocide and, deportations and so on and so forth. So not only people were deported, not only 200,000 Jewish members of Jewish community, Jewish Lithuanians were murdered, but there is a legacy. There are certain continuities that then somehow carries on after that for many years. So that's pretty straightforward. Another thing that this book drew our attention to was this hybrid identities and the entangled histories. Once again, I would like to stress that very frequently we focus on this inward look and kind of self-centeredness, and that takes this kind of approach takes away from this self-centeredness. So. Also, I would like to say that this book actually influenced my own work. Well, here, my book was mentioned from 2013, The Making and Breaking of Soviet Lithuania, Memory and Modernity in the Wake of War. And I have to say that it helped me to think about those continuities. I focused on the generation of the 1930s, the members of Lithuanian intelligentsia, that were active in the late Soviet period and then post-Soviet period, but I looked at the transformations of, it's at their transformations of their lives, so something like a collective biography, but also at the transformations of the country that also involved larger transformations, kind of in the entire region. So it was certainly informative and in many ways eye-opening for me. And Lithuanian scholarship does move towards that direction, that was called transnational, more transnational perspective. So I'm very glad that that this book will appear in Georgian, and I am sure that we will have the scholars from these very different regions, the Baltics, the Lithuania and Georgia. I'm sure we will have more comparative, really fascinating, interesting comparative studies that will bring forth even more, connections and processes that are very important for our identities, that will in a way connect us and will be revealing in this, illuminating in this way. So much from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Mr. Georgi Candela, who is a Georgian politician and historian. He's studied at Tbilisi State University and Duke University. But I think he's in Georgia. He's widely known as an outspoken critic of ambivalence towards the Soviet legacy in Georgia and the Caucasus in general, and especially in more recent years for his active efforts to deal with the almost ubiquitous presence of Stalin's memorialization in across Georgia. Upon his initiative as a member of the parliament, he was able to bring about the commemoration of the Soviet occupation of Georgia Day, the day of remembrance of victims of totalitarianism. And in 2012, Mr. Candela was heading the project of transformation of Stalin's museum in Gore into the Museum of Stalinism, which was halted, unfortunately, in more recent years. Today, Mr. Candela will explore Georgia's divided past, this divergence of memories that happened over the last few decades in Georgia. Mr. Candela.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be part of this panel and to speak about this book and somehow put it into Georgian context. As I wrote a post today on my Facebook page saying that everyone who wants to understand recent Georgian history should read this book, even though it says nothing about Georgia. It says nothing about Georgia. I got hold of this book some years ago when after I stepped into the Lithuanian History Museum in Vilnius. And I was really surprised to discover the documents of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and various statutes and books published in Cyrillic in what is now closest to Belarusian. And that was really a surprise to me. So I got hold of this book thinking that I would learn something about Lithuanian history, which was really a subject of interest for me. But I ended up learning not only a great deal about the history of Lithuania and all these countries, but also I learned a great deal about the modernization of nationalism or national identity or formation of modern nations. So I think anyone who wants to understand how this process actually worked should read this book. And I think this is really the best book in this subject, specifically in the modernization of nations, and really this focus on the personality of Adam Mickiewicz, with which the book starts, and it's really the main line somehow. The opening line of his poem, Pan Tadeusz, Lithuania, my motherland, and the construction of this line is really illuminating. First, it's illuminating in two ways. First, it's illuminating because it explains how actually it is possible for someone to say Lithuania, my fatherland, in Polish and be native speaker of Belarusian. That all of that can be possible at once, and how problematic, to say the least, it is to apply modern concepts to earlier periods in a blanket way. How it is difficult to apply, to look at this moment through eyes of modern nationalism. And finally, I want to bring in Georgian context and somehow link it all up with one symbol, an actor, and that is the personality of Stalin. Personality of Stalin, because I think there is no better symbol that encapsulates the clash of these different narratives and different worldviews, if you will, on the one side of ethno-nationalism, on the other side of civic nationalism in Georgia. On the one side of someone of whom Georgians should be proud. He came out of poor family. He achieved so much. He won the war. Never mind that he started this war too. Shouldn't a patriotic Georgian be proud of Stalin? Of course. But this worldview contrasts with the other worldview that because of Stalin's personal agenda, the Democratic Republic of Georgia, the country whose memory only now we start to appreciate and realize, the country that had democratic institutions, the country that had elections, the country that had women parliamentarians and jury trials, that country that was also internationally recognized on the same day as Latvia and Estonia by the Allies in 1921 in January, that country got invaded very early because of Stalin's personal agenda, that he was already in the power struggle, and should his native land remain outside this project, of course, his chances to prevail in that power struggle would have become highly questionable. So why all of this is relevant today in 2021? It is relevant, very much relevant, because this whole propaganda warfare against Georgia specifically is clustered around the personality of Stalin. Stalin, because of course he was from Georgia, and this fake anti-Western Georgian nationalism, which is an artificial construct, but which has nevertheless penetrated the white public discourse in Georgia enormously. And that is a fact. Outside this NGO bubble in Tbilisi and outside, so to speak, the bubble, it's a very popular word these days in Tbilisi, the incorporation of Stalin into Georgian nationalism is already an accomplished fact by our very dear neighbor. That is an accomplished fact. And a testament to that is the emergence, the astonishing emergence of 10 new statues of Stalin. I was saying 9, but I discovered one more after 2012. Can you imagine that? 10 new statues of Stalin in Georgia. We mark the day of Soviet occupation of Georgia on the February 25th and lay wreath on the memorial of cadets that died in the war that Stalin initiated. And then we erect statues to Stalin. So I think to realize and to fully appreciate this dramatic transformation that led up to the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, which in itself we only, as I already said, only now start to appreciate the complexity and the success of that attempt of modern state building. I think everyone should read this book to be more aware of what was going on and how to look at this period and how to deal with this period, which I think, and with that I'll end, which I think is one of the key challenges in front of Georgia today, how to deal with the Soviet period and how to regard Stalin in particular. Was there anything good about him at all or not? Was 20th century any kind of moving forward? Because that's the cliche that we still progressed. You know, Soviet Union built metro in Tbilisi, didn't they? Or it was a gigantic throwback for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Candelaki. Our last panelist is the man who wears many hats. Professor Beka Kobahidze, I don't know how he does it, frankly, because he is, on one hand, involved in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he serves in a special monitoring mission to Ukraine. On the other hand, he is the associate professor at Ilia State University and lecturer at the Georgian Institute for Public Affairs. In fact, he is the spearheading efforts to start a new faculty of modern history at Ilia State University, which has already recruited a new generation of students. And he's also an eminent historian. He is lectured at the University of Georgia and the Caucasus University. He was visiting fellow of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Oxford. And his research interests lie in foreign policy of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, specifically in the historical intersection between Russia and the Western powers in Caucasus and the contested regional history of Caucasus in the 19th and 20th century. Professor Kobahidze.
Thank you very much for impressive introduction. First of all, let me thank NATO for what she's doing, because Georgia is a small country and Georgian readers are very few. When I was in Warsaw and I went to the bookstores, you have anything translated in Polish because there's over 60 million people reading in Polish. And maybe sometimes translating such brilliant scholarly masterpieces, translation in Georgian can be a thankless task, but it's not the first or second occasion NATO is doing that and Poesia Press is doing that, and I'm very grateful to her as a historian, and I'm also very grateful to my university for hosting today's panel. And I would also like to take an opportunity and say that, for example, our moderator, Alex Mikaberidze, is not only a professor at Louisiana State University, but lecturer at our university at Modern History of Georgia. And Georgi also, apart from being a politician, is a student at our program. So yeah, Ilion is widely present at our panel. Okay, let me go ahead as we are limited in time, and let me give you a brief overview of the Caucasian perspective of this book. So what we see, I mean, we are sitting and reading it in Georgia or overall in the Caucasus, this book. What we see, what are the lessons learned? If we look into the history textbooks of major stakeholders in the Caucasus, we'll discover 6 or 7 opposing or controversial historic narratives. And for example, and identities of the peoples of the Caucasus, modern identities are built upon these narratives. For example, we Georgians are saying that our historical legitimacy are on the lands from Nikopsi and Darubandamde, which means from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. Then Armenians would build their identity on the 1915 genocide and the Karabakh War. Turkey is built upon heterogeneity, and more recently Neo-Ottomanism. Russia seeks revival of the imperial and glorifies imperial past. Or Abkhazians takes their anti-Georgian view derived from the Beria purges, Laurent Beria purges in 1936, 38, and in 1940s, to be honest, and on Patriotic War of 1992, 1993. So, I mean, these are identities in the modern Caucasus, and these identities are not expressed by historians alone, but by politicians themselves. So, for example, we remember that, for example, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan frequently recalls that Yerevan is an old Azerbaijani town, and Azerbaijan should return back its town, or Azerbaijani people should return in its historic land, right? Or, for example, President Saakashvili in 2004 gave an oath, let's say inaugural oath, at the grave of David the Builder, Georgian monarch. Right, and this is how it works. You know, I mean, historians, society, and politicians all construct these narratives, and then these narratives are not compatible to the peace. Right, in the Caucasus, we didn't have people like Krzysztof Skubiszewski, about whom Professor Snyder speaks very extensively in his book. And this is Skubiszewski's architect of the foreign policy. Foreign policy is a separation of history from the present and from the future. Just to recall once more what Skubiszewski was saying. You know, none of us likes and adores what Stalin has done, what Nazis have done. You know, there have been many atrocities, ethnic cleansings, purges, like forceful relocation of people, division of borders, illegitimate sharing of land, etc., etc. But if we start now fighting and quarreling over these questions, we'll fight each other forever. And this question was reflected by Professor Snyder in his opening remarks. Instead, Skubiszewski and, of course, President Walesa suggested to the neighbors that we should all recognize our Soviet drone borders, no matter how much we dislike them. And we should combine a regional package of the states in order to build economies, in order to build prosperity of our peoples. And we all combined should resist reviving Russian imperialism. And that is why nowadays all this, Lithuania and Poland are members of European Union and NATO, right? Instead of Poland and instead of Skubiszewski, we had in the Caucasus Russia, right? We should all admit that, for example, taking the Georgian conflict, that nobody is innocent there. You know, there have been made mistakes from all sides, that's for sure. But there was Russia instead of Poland, you know, just encouraging secessionist movements inside Georgian state. And what Skubiszewski and Polish state did, now what is the different pattern? There was a Polish minority in Lithuania, specifically in Vilnius, who didn't feel very happy inside the newly declared independent state of Lithuania. But Polish state called on Polish minority to be subjects of the Lithuanian state and made a deal with Lithuanians that minority rights would be respected based on UN, OSCE, and Council of Europe principles, right? Whilst in Georgia, we had a case when minorities were supplied with arms, mercenaries, etc., etc. What can Georgia do currently? What can happen in the Caucasus? How can we incorporate, let's say, this northeastern European model? And what can Georgia do to bring about a breakthrough? I think there is only one path. That if Georgia state is successful in its Euro-Atlantic aspirations, if Georgia builds democracy and joins one day European Union, NATO, and shows to the other stakeholders of the region that this is a success story, this is the right path, all other paths are wrong, I think this can change the reality. So the successful paths are usually followed. Georgia cannot do it alone. Of course, Georgia needs Western support in this success. And I think this is the only right way Georgia can follow. Apart from that, I would like to reflect on several points. You know, when reading Professor Snyder's book, I was thinking about various questions from the history of Georgia. Professor Snyder perfectly explains us what are differences between medieval Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea at its height, and he explains us that that state has very little to do with the contemporary or current Lithuania, right? I mean, language was different, identity was different, culture was different, and then you have Georgian historians to glorify this golden age of Georgia from Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. And this golden age is taken very contemporarily, if I may say, as if people in 12th century of Georgia were the same, were of the same identities as they are today. So that's why I think that we definitely need professors like Timothy Snyder to write about how the nations were being shaped in the Caucasus. And about emergence of nationalism, that there are some kind of some things in this book which general audience or general public may find difficult to realize or even to believe. For example, that 19th century Lithuanians nationalism or emergence of Lithuania's nationalism was partly sponsored by the Imperial Russia. I mean, not with the goodwill, of course. After the Polish uprising in 1863, Russian Empire wanted to separate Lithuanian component from Poland, and similarly, the same happened in case of Finland when Russian Empire wanted to separate Finns or Finnish nobility from the Swedish one. They sponsored Finnish identity. And then I was thinking about 19th century history of Georgia, that Georgian nobility was the most loyal servant of the Russian Empire. It has its own history, but it's returned back as a boomerang. In one book, Ronald Sunny calls it a revenge of the past. Russia's planted nationalists returned back as a boomerang, and currently take Lithuanians, take Georgians, or even Finns. They are most ardent anti-Russians, right? These are the topics. I mean, this book helps us to think, to realize what is the logic of history, how it develops, and it gives us model, let's say, some kind of model to reconstruct very controversial history of the Caucasus. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you so much. Our next part of our presentation involves the questions from audience and discussion. And I do encourage all the listeners to send their questions, whether in Georgian or in English through chat, and I'll be asking them as they come. But to jumpstart this discussion, and I would like to pose the question to all the panelists, and that is something that's been touched in passing in your presentations, and that is the function of truth as the foundation of a healthy democracy. Dr. Snyder mentioned this notion of myths and whether historians should fight the myths or go along with them. What is your take? And I will ask maybe Professor Davolute to take the lead on this. And
right. Actually, it's a very good and a very complex question. Well, history and memory, as we all know, these are big topics, right? And it has been pointed out how memory that really gives us a possibility to select the facts from our historical past that makes us feel good, that makes us feel more, glorious, that makes us feel the continuity through history, seeing us as the nation, as one body, and so forth. This is a comforting feeling, we need heroes, we need martyrs, we need foundational traumas, because they actually mobilize emotions, they help us unite, and so forth. but there is a great danger to that. And critical history, something that we are still developing in Lithuania, in this region, is a challenge very frequently, because one has to encounter the moments of history that are difficult, that are traumatic, that are painful. I was talking about these gaps that one has to address, and how can one see discontinuities and continuities? How can one deal with the kind of these traumatic moments of history that make us uncomfortable, or that that kind of have been silenced for a long time? For example, to give you one example, now we have this, we have the debate about 1941, and the anti-Soviet uprising. There was a conference last week. There will be a conference in next week, and this is really among historians and amongst some memory activists, if you will. This is a really heated debate, and some points, that there is a potential there for for not only for conflict, but also for the political mobilization. But at the same time, I think now we understand that amnesia is not the way to go, really. And if in Lithuanian scholarship we do not face these issues come to us in a different way. I'll finish in a second. For example, we have this, what scholars would call the wave of post-memory coming from North America or Canada, basically the children or grandchildren of people who collaborated with the Nazis or were involved in, to a certain degree in the Holocaust. They try to come up with their personal histories, to investigate history from the family perspective. And then you have a family history kind of coming back from somewhere abroad, from North America or Canada, and once again, putting these events on a map. So to cut it short, this is a challenge, this friction between history and memory, between myth and truth. And so this ongoing dialogue and friction, but there is no other way to do it. One has to just face it and plow through it through dialogue and just genuine work of a historian. So sorry for this.
No, not at all. Thank you. Mr. Candela?
Well, I think to an extent it is, again, I look at it from the Georgian perspective, a job of historians to fight myths, and without too much theorizing, I'd throw in one particular myth, again, going back to the example that I drew, and that myth to a person who is more or less enlightened about the 20th century history sounds absurd. And that myth relates to the belief that Stalin was a secret believer, that he was secretly practicing religion, and that he, when the Nazis were sieging Moscow, he put the icon of Virgin Mary in an airplane which flew around Moscow, and that's why Moscow wasn't taken. In a 2015 survey, a very credible and rather large survey by Caucasus Research Resource Center, it emerges that 41% of Georgians, 41, that's a lot of people, believe that Stalin was indeed a believer. And in fact, that is something that the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church and many prominent bishops preach on regular basis. So should that utter and complete lie be confronted? Of course, yes, I think. So that would be my very quick answer with an example.
Professor Kobachidze?
As a historian, I agree with Professor what Professor Snyder said, and I will make let's say my version of this answer. Yeah, if you fight specifically some myths, you legitimize them. Because if you target something, there will be always on the other side, having suspicion in you, or disliking you, or disliking your values, as therefore glorifying the myth, right? What we should do, historians, we should write a history, of course, without myths, of course, with a wider context, and of course, respecting all the modern standards, whatever they are in history, right? And in this case, you also explain, as you are telling the story or history, these myths are becoming part of the history. Their emergence, their participation in society, and if you offer a high quality good history, in the end it will prevail, but these myths will stay somewhere as a part of the history. Problem in modern Georgian historiography is that we have very weak or toddlering, you may say, even toddlering historiography. For example, in 1943, amidst the Second World War, under the directions or directives of Stalin, there was published history textbook on Georgian history from the ancient times to 19th century in 1943. And if you read that book and compare them with the modern history textbooks, and if you compare them with narratives of Georgian historians, there is very little changed, if anything. So this memory is very much constructed, and we cannot even fight it, because in order to fight, first you have to write free history, history of independent Georgia, or history of historians of independent Georgia, right? So this very basic task is still ahead. That's my take on it.
I know that His Excellency had to go to another meeting, but we have Georgi Mamoulia with us, and if he is listening, I would like him to turn his camera on so we can so I can get him into the discussion. But here's the question I have for the panelists, and Dr. Mamoulia, you're welcome to participate. Timothy Snyder's book is entitled Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus. What will it take to write a book, Reconstruction of Nations, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan?
It seems to me, first of all, I would like to see that when I was reading this book, or I have read this book past, but I studied it very attentively before to write down, the comments and others. It seems to me, first of all, I had the idea that there are many very interesting topics there, because, for example, Rzeczpospolita was a state with Poles, with Lithuanians, with Ukrainians, so regional, regional state. And it seems to me that this regional state was, well, at any rate, it was a great state, quite effective. Of course, finally, it was dismantled, but at any rate, it seems to me that the regional cooperation, the regional unification is quite fruitful. And it seems to me that in Caucasus also, it seems to me that these regional ideas, regional unification, regional cooperation can be really very fruitful and really very interesting, it seems to me. And it's, of course, I understand that between the Poles, between Lithuanians, between Ukrainians, it's maybe less differences as between Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis. But at any rate, the example of Rzeczpospolita, the example of cooperation, the example of reunification of these three people in one state will be was very interesting. So it seems to me that the same. It seems to me that it gives us very interesting source to think about our regional cooperation and also to think about our history. For example, the state Georgia in the period of Tamara, in period of the David, it was the unification based on the same basis, it seems to me. So there are really very interesting parallels between what happened in Rzeczpospolita, for example, in Eastern Europe in the period which Professor Snyder describes very interesting, and what happened in medieval age in Caucasus. So it seems to me there are a lot of parallels which will be really very interesting and really very useful for Georgian readers at any rate to draw some comparisons and to draw some conclusions from this. So it seems to me it's really very interesting, and it gives also it gives maybe some possible ways of resolution with our relations with our neighbors, even with the Abkhazians, with the Ossetians, with other neighbors. So it seems to me that it's really a very interesting book. I must, of course, it is difficult for me to agree with all conclusions and with all assertions which Professor Snyder speaking in this book. But at any rate, it's very interesting. It's very fruitful for us to, at any rate, to make comparisons between the situation which was in this period in Eastern Europe and situation which was in Georgia, and maybe also it gives us quite possible ways of solution of our relations with our neighbors. So it seems to me that's what I want to say. Yes, thank you very much.
Let me maybe a little bit narrow the question and essentially to ask whether such a project is possible in light of realities, historiographic realities in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. That is, Professor Kobahidze mentioned that we really don't have a good modern historiographic base to start with. What's the situation in our neighbors? Becca?
Regarding the historiography of the neighbors, it's also very nationalistic. In Azerbaijan, I would say that it's even mythological. In Armenian case, you can divide historiography into two. One is Yerevan Armenian historiography, and another is American Armenian historiography. Of course, American Armenian historiography is very much advanced, but still, these two is nationalistic, but in the frames of academic standards, of course. And it's like, I wouldn't even mention Abkhazian and Ossetian historiography because those are very much isolated, and to many ways mythologized. So the major problem is that historians are viewed in these countries, and historians view themselves as soldiers of the nation, soldiers with the pens and pencils, that we should fight for the rights or for the justification of our nations, or of our legitimacy over this or that land, etc., etc. So, I mean, in this prospect, in this light, prospects are very blurred. But on the other hand, as I said, all people in the world universally want to have a good living standard, right? And if Georgia, with its Euro-Atlantic aspirations, proves to be a success story, this success story can be followed. And this is exactly why Russia wants Georgia to fail as a success story. And I'll give an example of the last Karabakh War, when on the one side you had kind of modernist liberal Democrat Pashinyan, and on the other side you had authoritarian Aliyev, and had liberal Democrat Pashinyan won this battle or this war, then his way or Pashinyan's way would become a success story. So Russia will always, or at least current Russia, will always support failure of liberal democracy and Western values in the Caucasus. But Georgia's task should be, it's a political task, should be that we manage at some stage to break through.
Mr. Candela, let me give you a chance to answer it. So to reframe the question that I posed, what lessons does reconstruction of nations contain for us, for Georgians?
Well, I think I mentioned this lesson, if you will, is the peculiarity of applying the constructs and concepts that are in use today to periods before they were invented or before they appeared. So the application of standards of modern nation state to periods, in our case, medieval periods, because we view Georgian nation, I think this has been, in other words, already been mentioned. We view the Georgia of medieval period or this mythologized period through the eyes of modern nationalism, and that's highly problematic. And the understanding of formation of modern nations, it really is illuminating that the medieval statehood experience of Georgia is very interesting, but I think our understanding of that period is very much mythologized and far from reality, so to speak. And reading this book, even though it doesn't mention Georgia at all, is very illuminating and refreshing in that way. But also, I would argue, as someone who is committed and interested, of course, with under guidance of our dear friend Becca, in sort of rethinking the experience of the Democratic Republic of Georgia and its credentials. This book strengthens anyone who is interested in this subject too, because it also illustrates what a complex process it was, what complex processes were in place that eventually culminated in the creation of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, and perhaps also offers a possibility to scrutinize the democratic credentials of Georgia, which from today's perspective look rather impressive, because in some cases things were less toxic than for other modern national projects, and successful.
Thank you so much for your answer. I think that's it, folks. I really appreciate all the panelists for their insightful commentary. I want to thank Professor Snyder for taking time from his busy schedule to share his thoughts on this interesting book. I'm especially grateful to Heinrich Böll Foundation, to Ilias State University, and to Poesia Press for making this book possible. Go grab it. As Ms. Alkhazishvili told us, the book is already available in the bookstores. And don't Don't forget to share your commentaries, whether in social media or send it directly to to the press. This has been a wonderful evening, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mikaberidze Aleko. Thank you so much. This has been much appreciated. Georgi Beka, thank you very much. Georgi Mamulia also, and Katie, I want to thank you once again, and the Heinrich Böll Foundation and the Ilia State University. Many, many, many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the translators.
Yes, thank you to the translators, of course.
Yes.
And the interpreter, we had an interpreter. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.